So joining me now is Amjad Iraqi. He's the senior analyst at Crisis Group for Israel Palestine. Thanks so much for talking with us. You're in London now, but obviously you travel a lot. You've lived in Haifa. You travel a lot back and forth to the region. Why are we seeing such a spike in settler violence in the West Bank?
Thanks so much for having me, Hala, first of all. I mean, everything since October 7th, for the Israeli state, the security establishment, the settler movement has been, after that initial shock of October 7th, has been a major opportunity on many fronts. We've seen this obviously in Gaza with the depths to which the war has been carried out, massively displacing 2.1 million Palestinians, shriveling and shrinking Gaza to such an extent,
Hmm.
and seeing the Israeli state really recarve the strip. And the West Bank has really been no different. From the very get-go, we've seen the settler movement really make major strides in seizing more land, in launching violent attacks against Palestinians, with the Israeli army doing the very same. And this is not just in terms of Palestinian rural villages, but even sort of destroying several major refugee camps in the
Hmm.
north. And so under the kind of the cover of this war, or even as a essential part of this war, has been also recarving the West Bank as much as it has been recarving the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And
And sorry to jump in because I just wanted to ask you, is it fair to say that this is state sponsored and supported by the state of Israel and the West Bank?
Absolutely. It has always been the case. The settler movement could not be able to survive and thrive without the support of the state. And but we have definitely seen a much deeper sort of fusion, even more so than before, under this far right government under Benjamin Netanyahu, and
Hmm.
especially with figures like Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister and the sort of deputy defense minister, who's really
Hmm.
been kind of one of the spearheads of expediting a lot of these Israeli policies. So it's not
Hmm.
that this fusion is new, but the extent to which they are really pushing the boundaries and blurring or erasing any lines that might have existed between the settler project, settler enterprise, and the state are very quickly, very rapidly going. You see this both in the extent to which Israeli government is managing its budgets and its resources to settlements as if they were no different from Israeli cities and
Hmm.
towns. You're seeing this even on the ground to the extent to which when you do have settlers going into Palestinian villages, you will often have soldiers accompanying them, which again has always been the case, but you're seeing them even more so. The extent to which settlers are being represented in the military and guiding military thinking.
Hmm.
And that alignment more and more between even the hilltop youth on the ground and your highest government cabinet members is showing the extent to which this is really being carried out, especially since October 7th.
So what I find interesting when you speak to people from who are outside the region is they say, well, this is Netanyahu specific, it's Netanyahu dependent. But from what I'm hearing you saying, this has really been either tolerated or actively encouraged, the settler movement for decades. I mean, you have settlements in the West Bank that aren't even settlements. They're basically cities with hospitals and schools and their own roads and the rest of it. So it really, if Netanyahu goes in October, will anything change?
There may be changes to the manner in which the settler enterprise is continuing to kind of grow and expand. And it's not to say that there aren't any kind of differences and frictions within the Israeli political and security establishment or the Israeli public about it. But there's still a fundamental underlying consensus. I mean, we can take this back historically, that the first Israeli settlements that were built after the occupation of 1967 were carried out by kind of a labor government, a sort of theoretically center-left government, and they saw this as strategically advantageous. They even aligned with some of the ideological points of the settler movement. They even saw this as a security necessity to establish settlements to entrench military control in the occupied territories. Even
Mhm.
during the Oslo Accords with Yitzhak Rabin and Perez, you still saw settlements kind of growing and expanding. And so this has been quite consistent. Now, certainly the rate has increased when it is often under right-wing governments, and especially with this particular far-right government. Now, also you're seeing, especially in the context of the of this past war, there are a lot of frictions within Israeli society some who do see that the way that the settlers have been able to take so much matters into their own hands is eroding kind of discipline on the ground. It's eroding the ability of the army to kind of handle security needs. A lot of
Mm.
them see them as sort of kind of ideologically inserting themselves into the state and changing the character in terms of making the state more religious in its outlook, more hyper nationalist. And so these frictions do exist, and it's why you're hearing army chiefs, for example, constantly warning all the time against giving the settler movement too much power and too much authority.
Yeah.
But these differences, they're substantial, but they are tend to do more about the discipline of the way the settler movement is moving forward rather than necessarily the fact that it is.
Right.
Again, the army has been part and parcel of seizing and confiscating Palestinian property and Palestinian land. They've been part and parcel of creating the legal and physical instruments to be able to move these things forward. So it's not
Yeah.
as if there's a different government. I think you might potentially, if it's one that's part of the anti-Netanyahu bloc, you may
Hmm.
see some taming of the impulses of the settler movement. But again, the underlying factors of the occupation, the settler movement, will not be addressed.
So I guess Palestinians don't really have any options here. It sounds like, I mean, if you put up a map of the West Bank with the number of settlements and how divided that territory is, and how really seemingly impossible it appears that a two-state solution, which is something that we still hear today, even though the reality on the ground would tell us just by looking at a map that that just sounds virtually impossible. What are the options for Palestinians in the West Bank?
It's difficult to say because I think Palestinians in both sides of the occupied territories have really hit a very existential moment. I mean, in Gaza, it's very evident that so much of their part of the homeland has been so utterly destroyed and the social
Mm,
fabric really torn apart. And in the West Bank, you're really coming into a point whereby the past 3 decades in which the Oslo Accords and the idea that everything was moving towards a two-state solution, seeing that dissolve so rapidly, and not just in terms of the paradigm itself, but even the institutions of Oslo that
mhm.
actually held up until October 7th. We're talking about Israel's economic hold in the occupied territories, its security coordination with the Palestinian Authority, and many other factors which actually institutionalized much of the occupation. Even that is being whittled away because a far-right government, a far-right Israeli government, is deliberately dissolving them to say
Yeah.
even those arrangements we no longer want to see continuing. And again, there's debate within the Israeli establishment of that.
But what I find
For
interesting
Palestine,
too, sorry, I just the intensification and the expansion of the support for this settler movement also extends into, technically speaking, Palestinian Authority areas. And after Oslo, I think people thought, and oftentimes also when you hear from people outside the region who may not be following the story as closely, they will tell you, well, Oslo just gave the West Bank to the Palestinians and look what they did with it. But that was never the case. There were three distinct areas, one that was Palestinian Authority controlled, and two others, one mixed and one that was still under Israeli security control. But today, that entire West Bank, with a weakened Palestinian Authority, is essentially occupied and administered with laws from Israel applying to Palestinian residents of those territories, right? So, I mean, there is no oxygen there for any Palestinian self-determination, right?
precisely. I mean, in the end, the Oslo Accords, for whatever good faith sort of intentions some officials had, both on the Israeli and Palestinian side, in the end became weaponized in order to deepen Israel's control of the territories. It legitimized it. It created these new institutions and these new agreements that actually said, for example, that 60% of the West Bank will fall under total Israeli civilian and military control. And
Mhm.
that even in the areas that belong to the Palestinian Authority, like major cities like Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jenin, that the Israeli army could still go in whenever they want to. And that even the economic arrangements for the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian economy writ large is still very much controlled by the Israelis. It has to be kind of cleared and vetted through them. My organization, Crisis Group, recently had a report uh,
Mhm.
talking about these levers and the way that they've been really mechanized even further, especially by Smotrich. And so Palestinians have really reflected and watched how much their homeland has been dissolving under those very accords and whittling away any prospect of a Palestinian state, which, if people believe could have been a possibility in the 90s, is nowhere near people's minds in terms of seeing a state that could actually be operate on the ground. And so
Yeah.
there is really a serious point of reflection where Palestinians are not sure where to go from here. They've, in many ways, as much as there's been a lot of international gains for the Palestinian movement on the ground, they are now on less land. They have less money, less resources to keep themselves on that land, up against a foe in their eyes, which is really being able to create a stronger foothold in their territory and strip away their agency. And the Palestinian leadership has not yet met the moment, nor been able to guide the people to say what comes next. Where have our
Right.
theories of change failed, and where do we go from here? And this is still being debated in some circles, but it is not having a functioning national movement to really guide them out of this predicament.
And I mean, the Palestinians I speak to in the West Bank, I would say, I mean, this is not a scientific poll, but I would say more than half tell me they would leave if they could. They would leave their homeland that has been their homeland for generations. And I hear that more from Christians, I have to say, than Muslims, but they basically tell me if I could take my kids out of here and live outside, I would.
You know, it's
Is
very
that the
relatable.
goal? I mean, is that the goal of the Israeli government, do you think? Just to have people leave or?
Yes, I mean they're quite explicit about this. I mean, Smotrich himself is one of the things he's kind of famous or infamous for is this kind of decisive plan, and the idea is that either Palestinians accept that they will be these kind of subject to Israeli Jewish superiority, or they have to leave. And
Yeah,
they've been very explicit about this in their plans and their rhetoric, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. Whether or not they can achieve it is a different question, but it's very evident that, especially under this government quite a concerted goal to make Palestinian life as untenable as possible on the ground. And so
hmm,
naturally, when you're surrounded by all these kind of factors, your security is completely gone. Money's not coming in as it used to, and you're watching and in this kind of constant state of fear and apprehension of what awaits you, not just again in these villages which have no protection out in the rural
right,
areas, but also inside major cities that nothing is safe, nowhere can you be protected, is really affecting a lot of Palestinian families who are looking out for safety for their families, who want to be able
sure.
to not just live but to thrive. And when they can't do that in their homeland, and they fear that existential threat, there's a natural inclination to say maybe it is to emigrate. And yet, even with that, a lot of people still try to keep their presence on the ground. They're trying to do their best and not to surrender to that. And even if they wanted to, they are still kind of subject to the occupation's restrictions. A lot of them don't have real official citizenships. They don't have the same kind of access to do that, and so they're kind of caught and trapped in this limbo with no clear way out.
And another thing I would add too is kind of the daily humiliation. And I think that's just not necessarily always a security question. It's just the humiliation of being constantly subjected to this, to these interrogations, to these checkpoints, to being herded like really like cattle sometimes to cross from the West Bank, say, into Jerusalem or to go from one area or another to another, or to have to travel 45 minutes from one village to another because, someone decided on the Israeli side to just close the road. So there's also that, and that's very wearing, isn't it, for people who live there? Just this notion somehow that they have to constantly put up with that. It's exhausting, isn't it? I mean, I felt exhausted for them, and I'm not Palestinian.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like minute by minute, when you're a Palestinian, you feel the way that everything around you is trying to make you lose any sense of dignity, lose any sense of normalcy, and to keep you on edge at any given time. And that's not just in the occupied territories, even the Palestinian citizens of Israel, like myself, even inside the Israeli state, it is this kind of sense that you don't. Like the state and the system does not want you to belong. They don't want you to feel that you can be comfortable at any given moment. I mean, this
Hmm,
is
hmm.
part of the burden of being a Palestinian on the ground, and you sense that certainly.
So let me, before we get to Gaza, ask you one question. What would change this? Because you so often hear, if only the United States put pressure on the government of Israel, regardless of who the prime minister in office is, all this could be resolved. Is that true?
It's partly true. The United States, by far and away, has the most leverage over Israel. It's its primary arms supplier, its diplomatic supporter. It is, the global superpower. And we've seen even just in the course of the war that when the US wants to exercise that leverage, not just on Palestine, but even looking at it in Lebanon and Iran, Israel often has no choice but to listen and to respond. And so that power dynamic is, there's no competition there. And we're seeing the way that this debate's unfolding in the US, which I think is really crucial. And that will certainly
Mhm.
play a critical role. But that is not the only basket to put hopes on. I mean, again, the conflict, just to reemphasize why to focus on Israel, especially, the conflict is a very asymmetric one.
Yeah,
Tons of pressures, tons of violence, tons of attacks are constantly on Palestinians. And it's not to say that there's not ways to also engage with them. But when you're in a situation of such severe occupation, such severe violence, where the occupying power has so much impunity, there needs to be a different kind of course correction in that power asymmetry to compel Israel to take a different course than the one it's been pursuing for the past few years. And so other actors that are also really crucial here, for example, is Europe and the European Union. So most people will know about the US in terms of arms supplies to Israel, but for a lot of Israelis, Europe is in many ways their backyard. Through Israeli passports, you can access much of the continent. There are a lot of Israelis who have second passports who buy properties in Europe. They can travel there for holidays. They have an association agreement between the EU and Israel that provides them access to research and development programs and all kinds of exchanges. So these privileges that come in the EU-Israel relationship, even on the course of this war, has barely been dented, despite even European governments trying to renegotiate what is their relationship with the state. But as long as those privileges are there, many Israelis on the social level will not really feel a cost. And so they do not see the need to
right.
really take a different direction if they're not feeling that cost. And so this is where the EU should actually recognize, as Israel's largest trading partner, the extensive leverage that they have, both in terms of
Sure.
with its you know, issuing a ban on settlements, which they repeatedly say are against international law and against their policy, or even other sanctions toward government officials or military officials, and so on. And the other kind of package of actors are our regional states, including like the Arab states and the Gulf states, where the conversation around Israeli normalization, I mean, it's not just the issue of leverage about, will Saudi Arabia or can Saudi Arabia persuade Israel to do certain things in order
Yeah,
uh, to buy normalization. That's not where Saudi Arabia is at. That's not where Arab states are at. But there are interests that even Arab states already have peace treaties or accords with Israel, have not actually put any of those treaties, at risk. They haven't really fundamentally questioned them. That includes
yeah,
Egypt and Jordan. And this is not to say that it requires them to cancel the treaties, but there are provisions there where even these Arab states, which are increasingly seeing Israel as pursuing rogue policies that are against their interests, or even Egypt, which has been in panic by the threat and the prospect of Gazans being expelled into the Sinai, and seeing no real fundamental difference with this government
yeah,
in particular, there is leverage that Arab states can exercise, but there are always ulterior political interests and bigger strategic geopolitical factors, including the Iran war, including the
sure.
relationship with the United States.
But
But this is not to say, but this is more than the US, basically.
you mentioned Europe. Europe gives Israel very favorable trade terms, which I think is something that isn't reported on a lot, and that is definitely a lever. Germany does supply, I think, 20% of, I think 20% of arms exports to Israel. You can understand why Germany is in a tougher position in terms of of speaking out publicly against Israel. But the Gulf states have such also something that isn't mentioned as much, such a deep security and cooperation with, for example, the UAE with Israel. They use some of their technology for surveillance. They buy that technology. I was in Dubai a few months ago. There were many, many Israelis there. There are direct flights from Ben Gurion to Dubai when Arabs complain they can't get a visa to go to the UAE. So there are lots of frustrations on the, Arab street, as it's called. I don't like that expression, but Arab public opinion with regards to how the Gulf states are dealing with this issue.
Indeed, and it's important to say that the Gulf is not necessarily united. I mean, the United Arab Emirates, for example, is much closer to Israel and to the United States policies on this than Qatar or Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
But even then, there's just questions to be raised, like for the UAE,
Hmm.
which has been quite close in coordinating with Israel and the US in terms of thinking of kind of reconstruction schemes in Gaza, of about delivering aid and so on for the UAE's particular interests. But even the UAE, for example, doesn't want to be investing uh, you know uh, its own funds and resources into Gaza if it may fear that a war might reignite at any given moment. And so
Hmm.
this is where even things like holding on to a ceasefire in Gaza, or even trying to prevent the worst from happening in the West Bank, is still even in the Emirates' interests.
Yeah.
And you go further along the spectrum and you sense that same thing. So.